Good morning, everyone. I feel honored also to be a part of this day. It's a very special day to honor a person who's been so meaningful in my life with her wisdom, her strength, and her undying commitment to supporting Indian causes and issues. She's an inspiration for all of us, I believe. Suzan Shown Harjo is one of those brave, relentless, and visionaries who gave rise to and played a pivotal role in a human rights movement that largely has been successful in curbing the mistreatments committed against American Indians in the name of science. Fortunately, she accepted the challenge to confront abusive powers exercised by the archaeology museum industry. She is the mother of the American Indian movement for repatriation. Repatriation is a component of American Indian struggles against the destructive, genocidal, and inhumane policies of the United States that suppressed Indian people under colonial domination. And we're still struggling to overcome those situations. The archaeological museum community was not a significant entity. It was sort of like when Suzan became involved in this struggle and others of us later on, we were taking on this giant and we were the mice because the way that our political power had been suppressed by the U.S. government, but our spirit and our resiliency remained unchanged. You know, we were willing to fight. Repatriation is one of those my endeavors that took me away from home for long periods of time, doing research, writing reports, and engaging in consultations with museum people. It was very frustrating but meaningful work, and I think that we have prevailed to a large extent in this struggle. Development of this industry began in the late 1800s, and this industry increasingly positioned itself to become one of the leading violators of American Indian human rights. Its adherents used the scientific racist perspectives in vogue at the time to rationalize the looting of Indian graves and shipment of the contents to repositories across the nation. The U.S. military encouraged its personnel to decapitate Indians killed in battle and to loot Indian graves, and then to send those prized items to the Army Medical Museum here in the Washington, D.C. area, where studies were being done to prove the superiority of the white race. It wasn't the Army Medical Museum that started this. Craniometric analysis that had been going on before then, started by a guy named Samuel G. Morton in this country, who's called the father of physical anthropology. Under a 1906 U.S. law, the Antiquities Act, which was just mentioned a moment ago, museums, universities, and federal agencies became designated repositories for the storage of thousands and thousands of Indian remains and millions of funerary objects, along with other objects collected along the way, which we call objects of cultural patrimony and sacred objects and funerary objects as well. As time progressed, over 118,000 human remains ended up in these facilities, and many other remains are still in Europe. So there was a lot of interest in dead Indians and probably more respect placed to our deceased ancestors than to our living people and to our views. My first meeting with Suzan occurred here in Washington, D.C. in 1989 when I came here with a Pawnee delegation to meet with Secretary Robert McCormick, I believe his first name was Robert, of the Smithsonian, and also Doug Osley, who was a anthropologist and a forensic anthropologist and an archaeologist working here at the Smithsonian. We wanted to talk to McCormick about Pawnee remains, Records indicated that there were a number of Pawnee crania here, and we suspected that these were Pawnee scouts who had been killed and decapitated by the United States Army after they had been discharged in 1869. I subsequently did a study on that for the Native American Rights Fund and the Pawnee Nation, and did confirm our beliefs. And we also wanted to talk to Osley at that meeting, Doug Osley, about his holding of Pawnee remains that he got from Louisiana State University and that he carried with him wherever he went for study. And so he gave a classic scientific rationalization for not wanting to repatriate those remains, saying that suppose that there was a plane crash and those victims could not be identified. Why those remains are needed is so that students can learn how to do facial recognition techniques so they can identify the deceased. Well, how does that benefit our people? You know, if those remains were so important, why didn't U.S. society open up non-Indian graves to conduct these studies? Well, this is a part of the problem, the discrimination and the racism that was a part of the formation and the perpetuation of those laws. Suzan was at that time the executive director of the National Congress of American Indian, and she had a little office. I remember her just being so full of energy, so dynamic, and she would drink these little vials of something. I wasn't sure what it was. And later I learned from her it was ginseng. So she got me started on that, try to give me more energy and boost and clarity of thought. Well, those things come through prayer and through contemplation as well. So I'm not sure if the ginseng helped at all. Later that year, later that year, 1989, that's when Congress passed the first Repatriation Act, the National Museum of the American Indian Act. And the following year, more sweeping legislation called NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation, which provided American Indian nations and Native Hawaiians a legal avenue to repatriate those human remains, funerary objects, and sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony in these museums. Also, during this time period, numerous states began to pass similar legislation. But the story of Suzan's involvement in repatriation began in that meeting we've heard about that occurred at Black Hills in 1967. But even before that, Suzan has told of visiting a museum in New York City, where that image a while ago of that the dress of the young Cheyenne woman was blood-soaked, and it had definitely come from her body, that item. And she wrote about that. She said about that visit with her and her mother to the museum. There we saw nightmarish things. We saw clothing that Mom believed she and her family had buried her grandfather in. They also saw a small buckskin dress for a very young Cheyenne girl. It had a bullet hole where the belly had been and dried rust patterns surrounding the part of body where she had been shot. Disturbed by this gruesome exhibit, they departed the museum, and outside her mother started saying things to her, such as, those things do not belong here. What can we do to get them back? So this type of situation inspired Suzan to become involved in the American Indian repatriation movement as one of its founders. I had a similar experience when I was in the service in 1969, stationed in Bainbridge, Maryland. I came here to visit the National Museum, the National Museum of Natural History. And when we walked into that building, what was greeting me and the other visitors were a roll of Indian crania on display. And I was shocked by that. And that image continues to stick with me today. So anyways, to get back to Suzan, she took up her mother's challenge. Later that year, she asked Vine Deloria Jr., the executive director of the National Congress of American Indians, for advice about what could be done to get those remains out of museums. And his response was he didn't know, but he would help her formulate a strategy, and then that he would support her work. So then that monumental meeting at Bear Butte occurred 2 years later, and that's when religious leaders from mostly the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux peoples came together to discuss issues facing Indian people. You know, the disrespect that Indians received at the hands of non-Indians. The museums and their collections became a big part of this discussion as well. So that meeting became a place where the repatriation ideas were contextualized as an oppressive and ongoing problem facing indigenous peoples. She wrote about this experience as well. We didn't talk much about museums because a museum was a hated thing to us at the time, where there were more dead Indians in the United States and other repositories than there were living Native Americans. A museum was a thing that held our ancestors as prisoners of war. A museum was a place that kept our living beings locked up and where people told lies about us. So this meeting, as I mentioned, provided the foundation for the repatriation movement. This movement questioned the merits of scientific studies and museum curatorial practices while advocating the repatriation and reburial of human remains and funerary objects from a human rights perspective. It viewed the taking of human remains from graves for study and curation as acts of desecration, sacrilege, and harm to the living. Those who participated in meeting the accepted principles that the living descendants of the ancestors and museums had a spiritual responsibility to speak for them became important members and leaders of the movement, like Suzan. So this became the position of the movement, and it's still intact today when we engage in discussions about museums. After that meeting, Suzan and others traveled to Indian country to discuss issues, and museums was a part of this. Issues of cultural rights matters were expressed everywhere. And those meetings helped formulate some of the terminology that was later used in development of the repatriation laws. Suzan and others recognized that in order to obtain non-Indian support for this cause, they would have to change the lexicon. You know, the lexicon or the accepted wisdom was that science had a right to study our remains. It had a right to go into our cemeteries, to take the bodies, to study them, to put them on display. Science authority could not be a question, according to this lexicon. So we began to question that. We adopted language of human rights to advocate to the public and lawmakers about the injustices of offensive, dehumanizing, sacrilegious practices committed by the archaeology museum industry and U.S. law. Simultaneously, we also shared our beliefs about how grave looting disrupted the spiritual journeys of our deceased ancestors, created historical trauma, and violated our sovereignty. You know, the United States entered into hundreds of treaties with Indian nations, and not one time did we give up our right to control our dead. And at no time did any of us ever give our consent, or our ancestors give our consent for the looting of for the graves of our ancestors. So this was a colonial problem that we had to deal with. Repatriation advocates gained media attention by such acts as protesting and disrupting digs. Formed in 1974, the American Indians Against Desecration organization advocated universal repatriation and the repair and reburial of human remains. The Native American Rights Fund and the National Congress of American Indians soon became involved in the struggle and started using political pressure and publicity to seek state and federal repatriation and graves protection legislation. At universities and colleges, students took up the cause. So around the country, there was a lot of protests going on over the issue of scientific privilege, white privilege, if you will. With the protests capturing media attention, the archaeology museum industry could not simply dismiss or ignore our concerns. In 1973, seeking to mitigate the potential damage caused by the loss of cultural items, the professional organizations began to organize and try to find ways to win Indians over to their side. Their solution was to be more sensitive to Indian concerns and not display human remains, or if they did so, only do it for a compelling reason, which, in our view, there's no compelling reason to do something of that nature. Then a group formed called ACPAC, the American Committee for the Preservation of Archaeological Collections, which sought to blackball members of the archaeological community who participated with repatriation efforts. And they also helped support the legal costs of archaeologists who got in trouble for violating some of these new laws. So this was the confrontation, It was Indians pitted against scientific community. And we had many allies, I should mention as well. So it was not just an issue that Indians were fighting alone in this instance. With the repatriation movement gaining strength and winning the public relations battle, a dialogue meeting took place in the Heard Museum in Phoenix, Arizona in 1989. Suzan joined Walter Echo Hawk, Daniel Lewis, Cecil Anton, and others to present American Indian interests in those dialogue sessions. The repatriation proponents insisted that the language should be cast in human rights terms. But there were some people there on the archaeological side that resisted that because they saw that with the human rights dialogue or standard being put in place, that it would weaken their claims to having the ability to study these remains. Later that year, that's when we got the act I mentioned, the National Museum of the American Indian Act, and the following year, NAGPRA. So NAGPRA provided for the repatriation of sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony, funerary objects, and it was a very important piece of legislation, as I have mentioned. The job of ensuring compliance fell largely in the hands of Indian nations. The National Park Service was placed in control of NAGPRA, and right away we noticed that there was a conflict of interest because it was under the it was placed under the control of the Archaeological Division of the National Park Service. And that was like putting Colonel Sanders in charge of the chicken coop because there was a big conflict of interest. And some of the decisions made reflected that conflict of interest. Well, after NAGPRA, the so-called culturally unidentifiable human remains became an issue. And from a meeting that was held at Arizona State University in the early 2000s, we formed what's called the Committee for the Disposition of the so-called culturally unidentifiable human remains. And we began to advocate for repatriation, to make recommendations for policy. And Rule 10.11 that came about a few years back did provide for repatriation of remains that institutions could not prove that they had legal control over. But that act left out funerary objects. So it was a half measure that recognized our burial rights, because under common law, under all standards, funerary objects should not be separated from human bodies. Then we're fighting in the international arena also to get our ancestors back. Many of these items, as I mentioned earlier, ended up in Europe. And Europeans are now engaged in some of the same dialogue that we engaged in early on in this movement. So in conclusion, the repatriation laws resulting from Indian advocacy have changed the practices of museums and the operations of archaeologists. It has become generally accepted that the human rights of American Indians outweigh those of science. Consequently, American Indian nations have reburied thousands and thousands of ancestors along with funerary objects, and have reclaimed many sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony. Thank you, Suzan, for your role in this process, and your spirit, your knowledge, your wisdom will be with us for years to come. Thank you for listening.